Good morning. This week we are diving into our second question of the New City Catechism. But before we do that, just to recap last week a little bit, we looked at the first question, simply asking, what is our hope in life and in death? And we thought through the implications of the reality that we are not our own, but we belong to God. And some of the implications of that were simply that there is peace and hope because God holds us in his hands. And that there is a reordering of our lives that needs to happen because we don't belong to ourselves, but we belong to God. And so we reorient our lives around the purpose, plan, and will of God. And this week we are going to ask the question 2, and the reality is this question is bigger than a catechism can contain. It is bigger than a short devotional video can dig into and unpack. But it's an important question. So question 2 from the New City Catechism, what is God? God is the creator and sustainer of everyone and everything. He is eternal, infinite, and unchangeable in his power and perfection, goodness and glory, wisdom, justice, and truth. Nothing happens except through him and by his will. A.W. Tozer, in his book, The Knowledge of the Holy, first chapter begins with this statement: what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. And that's what this catechism question really is trying to get to. It's helping us shape what comes into our mind when we think about God. And we see the importance of that Tozer gets at, and that what we think about is when we think about God is the most important thing about us. We see it really in a few different places, but we are called throughout Scripture to fix our eyes on Christ. And as we do that, we are transformed from one degree of glory to the next. And so it's really an important thing that we fix our eyes on God, but we fix our eyes on God as he has revealed himself to be. And that's what this catechism question gets at. He is the creator, the sustainer of everyone and everything. Again, we see those throughout Scripture, but you see God's creative work in the book of Genesis. You see that he is the sustainer in passages like Romans 11 at the end of the chapter, or in Colossians 1:15 through 20, that God sustains everyone and everything. He is eternal, infinite, unchangeable in his power and perfection, in his goodness and his glory, in his wisdom and justice and his truth. We see his unchangeableness. Again, Scripture talks to these things over and over and over and over again. And we don't have time to unpack all of them, but a resource I would recommend to you would be a book on systematic theology. Wayne Grudem has a good one. Millard Erickson has one that I have used. But they dig into these ideas and concepts and the ways that God has revealed himself as the infinite, unchangeable God who is powerful and perfect, who is good and glorious, and all of these other aspects we could unpack for a long time. But for this week, the Catechism is pulled out of Psalm 86, verses 8 through 10 and 15. So let me read those for us. It says this: there is none like you among the gods, O Lord, nor are there any works like yours. All the nations you have made shall come and worship before you, O Lord, and shall glorify your name. For you are great and do wondrous things. You alone are God. But you, O Lord, are a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. And what I love about this psalm is this tension that we see between who God is and what God does. It starts, again, verse 8. There is none like you among the gods. There is no one like God. He is unique in his glory, power, holiness. He is God. He is above all things. He is sovereign, creator, sustainer. And so the psalm talks about who he is in this really general term. There is none like you. But not only does this psalm talk about God's being, who he is, but it also walks this line and holds this tension of what he does. There is none like you among the gods, nor are there works like yours. Or down in verse 10, you are great, God's being, and you do, God's action, wondrous things. You alone are God. And then we see some of that action specifically in verse 15, and it's action that comes out of his character, of who he is. You, O Lord, are merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. And so these are pieces of who God is, but because God is merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, he acts towards us according to who he is. But I think there's an important note on that D.A. Carson talks about. And he says this: when we are talking about the God of the Bible, and the God of the Bible is self-defined. He talks about himself as being eternal and righteous. He is the God of love. He's the God of transcendence. That is, he's above space and time and history. Yet he is the immanent God. That is, he is so much with us that we cannot possibly escape from him. He is everywhere. He is unchangeable. He is truthful. He is reliable. He is personal. And God has revealed himself in these ways, and he acts towards us according to this. But Carson goes on, what's really important to see and understand as God has disclosed himself to us, not only in words, but also in the whole storyline of the Bible's narrative. That is, we are not permitted to take one attribute of God and make it everything. We cannot. We must take all of his attributes and see God in line with the whole story of Scripture. And we see that throughout Scripture, there are a lot of themes that come up about God, but one of them is God's presence and how he relates to us and how he is, as Matthew describes him, Emmanuel, God with us. And so we cannot look at God for one of these things that we see in the Catechism. We can't say God is creator and just stop there. He is the creator and the sustainer. We have to see these things together. He is eternal and infinite, and he is good and just. And we hold these things in tension. He is loving, and he displays his wrath. We cannot think about and only hold to one attribute of God. We must hold to all of them, and that's what this catechism seeks to help us do. And so our God is great, and he does wondrous things. He is slow to anger and abounds in steadfast love. And for that, we are thankful, and we are grateful that God has not just revealed himself as this distant God who is far off, but he is the personal God who has entered in. And so that is what this catechism reminds us of. It reminds us that God is the creator, the sustainer, the eternal and infinite and unchangeable one in his power and his perfection, in his goodness and glory, wisdom, justice, and truth. And nothing happens except through him and by his will.